July 18, 1943. A jungle clearing near Munda Point, New Georgia, Solomon Islands. The air is thick, hot, and heavy with the scent of pulverized earth and rotting vegetation. You are following a small patrol of Imperial Japanese Army (IJA) soldiers, led by Colonel Kenjiro Soto. Their uniforms are ragged, their faces gaunt, shadowed by the relentless tropical sun. Their mission is a desperate one: reconnaissance behind American lines and, more critically, the search for any scrap of food or salvageable equipment. The Japanese strategy in the South Pacific was rooted in the fierce belief in Seishin, spiritual strength or willpower. The IJA doctrine prioritized offensive maneuver, speed, and the belief that the Japanese soldiers' willingness to fight to the death could overcome material disadvantages. Logistics, particularly the sustained flow of supplies across vast ocean distances, was often an afterthought, secondary to aggressive tactical objectives. For Colonel Soto and his men, the reality was starvation. Japan's industrial base, while strong, was already strained by the war in China and the Pacific expansion. The American submarine campaign was beginning to throttle the supply lines, and Japanese logistical planning was notoriously insufficient, often relying on soldiers living off the land or capturing enemy supplies. Soto had lost half his company not to bullets, but to malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. Their rifles, the Type 99 Arisaka, were clean, but their ammunition pouches were nearly empty. They subsisted on a meager ration of rice mixed with jungle weeds. The patrol moves silently through the dense foliage, the sounds of distant American artillery a constant, dull thrumming backdrop. They are operating just kilometers from the American-held Munda airfield. Soto had been told by command that the Americans, like the Japanese, must be facing supply difficulties on this newly captured island. He expected to find a typical forward operating base, muddy, disorganized, and thinly stocked. They finally reach a small, elevated ridge, carefully crawling forward to peer down into a broad, newly cleared valley. Soto raises his field glasses, expecting a small, temporary depot. What he sees brings his patrol to a dead stop. The site is not of a disorganized camp, but of an industrial-scale logistical operation, blazing under the afternoon sun. It is a spectacle of relentless, overwhelming material wealth that defies the scale of the small island. It is a vision of American power that is impossible to reconcile with the Japanese doctrine of fighting without. The sheer size of the American supply chain is about to strike Colonel Soto, and through him, the Japanese High Command, with the force of an armored fist. This glimpse behind the curtain of American combat operations will prove more devastating than any artillery barrage. The shock of abundance, United States. This glimpse behind the curtain of American combat operations will prove more devastating than any artillery barrage. Colonel Soto's eyes, trained to measure survival in handfuls of rice and single rounds of ammunition, struggled to process the scale of the American supply depot sprawling below the ridge. This was not a hastily established forward base. It was an efficient, terrifying spectacle of industrialized warfare logistics. The centerpiece was the ammunition dump, a vast field organized with geometric precision. Crates of $75/text $, and $105/text $, artillery shells were stacked in pyramids higher than a man, extending hundreds of yards. Interspersed were pallets loaded with shiny, new 50-caliber ammunition belts, enough to feed the roaring air cover for weeks. The quantity of high explosives alone suggested a war of attrition that the Japanese, with their diminishing naval capacity, could never hope to withstand. Beyond the ammunition, the fuel stocks were equally staggering. Massive, cylindrical fuel drums, painted in uniform colors, lined up in tight, seemingly endless rows, ready to power the fleets of landing craft, trucks, and aircraft. The sight of this excess of gasoline and aviation fuel was particularly shocking to Soto, whose own air units often flew one-way missions due to fuel rationing. Then came the vehicles. Dozens of brand-new GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half trucks, not salvaged wrecks, but factory-fresh machines, were parked in perfect formations. Nearby, rows of gleaming jeeps and earth-moving bulldozers stood ready, symbolizing the American ability not just to fight, but to permanently alter the terrain to suit their war machine. The Japanese fought for control of jungle paths. The Americans simply carved new roads. But perhaps the most psychologically crushing sight for the starving Japanese patrol was the ration depot. Here, beneath immense canvas awnings, were colossal stacks of canned goods, dried provisions, and crates of fresh food. Soto focused his binoculars on a group of burly American quartermaster troops laughing as they loaded cases labeled sea rations, pre-packaged meals complete with meat, coffee, cigarettes, and candy. These soldiers were well-fed, healthy, and treating their supplies with casual carelessness, tossing boxes that represented a king's ransom in nutrition to the Japanese. Warrant Officer Hiroshi, kneeling beside Soto, whispered hoarsely, How can they have so much? Where does it all come from?" Soto did not reply. He saw not just the supplies, but the vast, unseen infrastructure that fed them. The enormous cargo ships, the secure ports in Hawaii and California, the millions of civilian workers back home dedicated to maintaining this flow. He understood that the American soldier was not fighting alone. He was the final, disposable point of a continent-sized economic engine. The Japanese had gambled that their small, committed forces could defeat the Americans before they could fully mobilize. This supply depot was the physical, undeniable proof that the gamble had failed. It was not a tactical problem. It was an existential one. Japan could field warriors, but America fielded industrial civilization. The logistical gap and strategic realization. The Japanese had gambled that their small, committed forces could defeat the Americans before they could fully mobilize. This supply depot was the physical, undeniable proof that the gamble had failed. It was not a tactical problem. It was an existential one. Japan could field warriors, but America fielded industrial civilization. Colonel Soto spent another hour observing the American depot, not for tactical weaknesses, but for sheer absorption of the material reality. Every movement he tracked, every truck rolling easily over the newly laid gravel roads, every pallet lifted by a powerful forklift, every machine gun being casually mounted on a jeep, underscored the devastating logistical gap between the two nations. In stark contrast, when the Japanese attempted to resupply their forward positions, it often involved a single, fast destroyer making a desperate dash, a Tokyo Express run, under constant threat of air and sea attack, carrying minimal rice and ammunition. If a supply ship was sunk, the outpost starved. When an American supply ship was sunk, another one, identical and full, arrived the next day. Soto finally withdrew his patrol. He knew he could not risk an attack on the depot. Any small raid would yield minor, temporary gains but would expose his men to the overwhelming security forces and automatic weaponry guarding the supplies. The Americans could afford to dedicate hundreds of men and endless firepower merely to guarding excess material. The Japanese could not afford to waste a single soldier. Upon returning to his command post, located miles away in a damp, crude bunker, Soto immediately began compiling his report. His observations went beyond mere quantity. They addressed the quality and organization of American logistics. The supplies were fresh, meticulously catalogued, and moved with a terrifying, industrialized efficiency. This logistical infrastructure enabled the American tactical advantages, constant close air support, rapid construction of airfields and bases, and the ability to sustain non-stop combat operations. Soto's report, relayed painstakingly back to Rabaul, did not focus on the enemy's fighting spirit. Instead, it was a damning assessment of strategic inevitability. He concluded that the American victory was guaranteed not by superior martial skill, but by an inexhaustible, self-reproducing, industrial capacity. The traditional Japanese military view was that logistics were merely the means to sustain a fight. The American view, demonstrated here, was that logistics was the fight, the power to overwhelm, bypass, and bury the enemy under a mountain of steel and supplies. Soto realized that fighting the American logistics arm was like fighting the entire continent of North America. The bravery of the Japanese soldier, their Saishin, was mathematically irrelevant against this level of material projection. The war, Soto concluded, could not be won. Confessions of the captured High Command. Soto realized that fighting the American logistics arm was like fighting the entire continent of North America. The bravery of the Japanese soldier, their Saishin, was mathematically irrelevant against this level of material projection. The war, Soto concluded, could not be won. Colonel Soto's initial report was tragically prophetic, reflecting a realization that began to dawn on many Japanese officers isolated in the island fortresses of the Pacific. While High Command in Tokyo clung to unrealistic defensive projections, those on the front lines understood the truth, often only after their own capture. Following the fall of key islands like Saipan and Guam in 1944, American intelligence teams, including interpreters and analysts, conducted meticulous interrogations of captured Japanese generals and high-ranking staff officers. These sessions consistently returned to a single point of consensus, echoing Soto's earlier observation. The overwhelming shock was the scale of American material abundance. During one such interrogation on Saipan, a Japanese general staff officer, identified only as Major General Kenso, was escorted through a newly established American naval supply depot. This depot, built literally weeks after the invasion, was already servicing hundreds of ships and thousands of Marines. The general, who had spent the last 2 years overseeing starving garrisons on remote atolls, walked silently past enormous mobile repair shops, freshly arrived LVT amphibious tractors, and endless stockpiles of packaged water. When asked by his American interrogator, Major Frank Collins, what single factor he believed sealed Japan's defeat, Major General Kenso did not cite the atomic bomb, nor superior American air power, nor the B-29 raids. He gestured toward a mountain of $155 dollar artillery shells, stacked perfectly and glistening in the tropical sun. "We understood your power in the air," Kenso stated through the interpreter, his voice flat. "We understood the fleet. But when we saw this mountain of material, which you replaced every day, we realized that we were not fighting men. We were fighting a machine that had no end." This profound sense of material despair was often recorded by the Americans. The Japanese military had been taught to view the American focus on comfort and high living standards as a weakness, proof of a lack of scission. They believed the soft Americans would quickly break under the hardship of jungle warfare. Instead, the American system ensured that their soldiers were never truly hungry, always equipped with the latest weapons, and backed by seemingly infinite resources. The supply depot was not just a collection of goods, it was a visible manifestation of America's $24/hour dollar industrial cycle, a cycle Japan's small, resource-poor economy could never mimic. The Japanese soldier fought with outdated gear and empty stomachs. The American soldier fought with confidence, knowing the next ship would always arrive, overflowing with everything he needed, and more. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory towns and supply ports of the American West Coast. The final cost of underestimation. The supply depot was not just a collection of goods, it was a visible manifestation of America's $24/hour dollar industrial cycle, a cycle Japan's small, resource-poor economy could never mimic. The Japanese soldier fought with outdated gear and empty stomachs. The American soldier fought with confidence, knowing the next ship would always arrive, overflowing with everything he needed, and more. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory towns and supply ports of the American West Coast. The final, bitter irony for the Japanese command was the realization that their initial strategy, striking hard and fast before American industry could fully mobilize, was based on a fatal underestimation of that industrial capacity. They saw the United States as a nation of soft civilians. They failed to grasp its potential as a unified, wartime logistical machine. The logistics arm of the American military, the Army Service Forces, ASF, and the naval supply depots, achieved monumental feats. By 1944, the U.S. was moving the equivalent of 5 million tons of supplies monthly across the Pacific, an astonishing scale that dwarfed all combined Japanese logistical efforts. This effort didn't just maintain the fighting forces, it created entire, functioning cities on newly captured islands in weeks. The sight that shocked Colonel Soto and Major General Kenso, the mountains of sea rations, the endless fuel drums, the piles of ammunition, was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate, superior strategy. The Americans embraced the philosophy of redundancy and oversupply, ensuring that tactical defeats, equipment malfunctions, or unexpected consumption rates never halted an offensive. The ratio of supplies dedicated to maintenance and replacement was staggering compared to the Japanese model of bare minimum existence. This material superiority had a direct impact on morale and combat effectiveness. The American soldier, knowing his supplies were inexhaustible, fought aggressively, relying on overwhelming firepower. The Japanese soldier, knowing that every bullet and every calorie was irreplaceable, was forced into desperate, defensive measures. In the final post-war analyses, many surviving Japanese officers repeated the sentiment. The war was unwinnable the moment the American logistics machine found its rhythm. They understood that every American bullet fired represented a complex industrial chain that reached back to the mines of Minnesota and the oil fields of Texas. Their own scission could not bomb a factory in Detroit, nor could it stop a fully loaded Liberty ship crossing the ocean. The American supply depot, initially dismissed as a sign of wasteful Western materialism, became the definitive monument to American victory in the Pacific. It proved that in modern total war, victory belongs not to the army with the strongest will, but to the nation with the deepest reserves.